Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Pedalshift Project. The Pedalshift Project is a series of conversations, thoughts, and experiments around the bike touring lifestyle. From tips and tricks to ideas on how to ride your ride, let's shrink the world by bike. Show notes and more are available at pedalshift.net/083, and you can email the show, pedalshift@pedalshift.net. You can check out the show also on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 83 of the Pedalshift Project. I'm Tim Mooney, back again. I am with you in absentia? Is that how you say it? I did not take Latin. For those of you who took Latin, I apologize. I'm a faker. I'm a big faker when it comes to speaking the Latin. But in absentia means that, at least what I'm intending to mean, is that I am actually not here right now. I am actually bicycling a bike tour as you hear this, if you're hearing it when it is just released. Otherwise, I'm somewhere else. I know this makes no sense. Anyways, episode 83 is a topic show that I'm pre-recording in advance of my ride so that I can A, put out a pod as normal on Thursdays at 7 a.m., except for the off week when the newsletter comes out. P.S. Make sure you sign up for the newsletter if you haven't already. On the fourth week, the week that I take the break, that's usually the week I put out the Pedalshift newsletter, and it contains all sorts of goodies and witty writings and resources and things like that. Also, it gets you certain goodies when I'm out on bike tour, like these quasi-live podcasts that I do. So you get access to things like that, all for signing up for a free newsletter, and then you get to read my strange witticisms and bizarre takes on bicycle touring. So think of it as me in written form. Take that however you will. In any event, in episode 83, this is a topic show talking about tips for dealing with a wet tent. If you camp, if you're a camper as part of your bike touring, and I know not all of you are, so I recognize that this may not be the episode for everybody, but for those of you who do camp, you will probably camp in the rain at some point. And one of the biggest questions I get, one of the most frequently asked questions I get about camping and bike touring is, how do you deal with a wet tent? It is a barrier, I think, for a lot of folks who are beginners because they don't know what to do with the situation where you've got rain going on. I think for a lot of people, bicycling in the rain is a real impediment. And I understand that. When I first got started, I tried to avoid bicycling in the rain as much as possible. And then I went on my first bike tour. Well, not really my first big bike tour. I've talked about this before. I was on the climate ride. Again, a great organized ride for a cause if you're into the issues of global warming and preventing that and working against that. Also, really good people who are really smart and really good patrons of bicycle touring as well. And they do all sorts of different ones around the country. I happened to do the one in California many years ago, and it was supposed to be during dry season, October. It's supposed to be really great in California that time of year. Well, as I've told the story multiple times on this show, it rained, and it rained a whole lot. So for somebody who tried to actively avoid the rain when I was doing my tune-up rides and my mini tours on the C&O, I got a real baptism, insert water joke here, for riding in the rain and camping in the rain. And I think I learned a lot there, and I've learned a lot subsequently, and all of this comes into this episode. So, how do you deal with the wet tent? That's sort of the bottom line. You've got you dealing with it when you ride. I mean, that's a question of rain gear and personal preference and all that other kind of stuff. But let's say you wake up in the morning and there's been rain overnight and your tent is wet. Hopefully just your tarp, maybe a little bit on the sides and the bottom of your tent. Maybe your tent's completely failed and there was driving rain and wind and your tent is soaked too. Here's what I would say would be my tips for dealing with that kind of a scenario. Because guess what? It's going to happen if you're a camper. I think the first thing I would say is you want to be prepared in advance for such things. So the first thing I would say is make sure that your tent is properly waterproofed to begin with. Now, if you've got a brand new tent, it's probably not going to be that big of a deal. If you've got a tent like mine, which is a few seasons old, you may want to consider doing some seam sealing in spots on the tarp and also, of course, in the seams of the bottom of the tent. One thing that I really recommend for folks who have a new tent is to make sure that you've got a footprint for the tent, not to keep your tent dry. It doesn't really keep your tent dry in rain situations, but what it does is it reduces the amount of wear and tear, especially at those bottom seams. So make sure you've got that. Seam seal when appropriate, as appropriate. I know a lot of people who get brand new tents and do it straight out of the bag. I know a lot of people that don't touch it. I know a lot of people that do it every year and everything in between. So your mileage may vary. Consider doing it. Tons of great YouTube videos on how to do it. Really simple, easy products where basically it's just a liquid that you drop along the seam. Sometimes you paint it on, let it dry, and then you're all set. That will fill in those micro holes and prevent from water intruding in the first place. Really important, really helpful, keeps you dry. That's really good. Second thing that I would say in terms of preparation is to make sure you choose a good spot to pitch the tent in the first place. And the reason why I say this is that sometimes you may think it's a good idea to pitch under, say, a tree canopy, because it's going to protect you to maybe the harsher aspects of the rain. But let's give a hypothetical here that the rain that's forecast or the rain that you're going to get is going to end sometime in the middle of the night. Well, in my experience, if you go underneath a tree canopy, you're going to continue getting drips of rain all night long as they come down off the leaves, and they'll continue to come on your tent. In fact, I've been in a tent thinking for sure that the rain was still continuing when the reality is that it had ended hours before that. So what you may have a scenario is that if you go underneath the tree canopy, you will still have a wet tent even if the rain is completely ended. And if you had been maybe a few feet away and taken the direct hit all night long, but then had dry weather for, say, 4, 5, 6 hours, the tent may be closer to dry in that scenario. So think about that. Another issue where I've found an issue. That seems redundant, don't you think? Another place where I've had an issue is in foggy spots, especially those coastal rides that I've done on the West Coast. You would be surprised how easy it is for a tree to grab the moisture from a good foggy fog bank, again, redundant, and will drip on the tent. There have been plenty of situations where there have been people around me who have had perfectly dry tents or very moderately, fog-kissed moisture, as opposed to my tent, which got a ton of moisture on it from essentially a mini rain shower underneath a tree. So think about where you're pitching that tent. It may be better to be away from overhangs and things like that. It really depends. If you've got an opportunity during a rainstorm to be underneath an Adirondack shelter or underneath a picnic shelter or things like that, that can be a really good idea. Preserves the dryness of your tent for another day, and I always take advantage of that when I can. It's #not cheating as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so you've got a good tent, you've got it all seam sealed, you've picked a good spot for it, but you're still going to get rained on. Let's talk about the different scenarios and what I would recommend and what you may want to consider doing in different scenarios. Here's scenario number 1. Let's say it's not raining in the morning and you're not in any kind of a rush to get out of camp. That's actually kind of gold right there. And in this instance, the things that I have to say probably aren't rocket science. First thing I'd say is shake off as much of the wetness as you can once you remove the gear from your tent. So take off the rain fly, give that a real good shake, and try to get as much of it off as possible. A good rain fly is probably going to have the water really beat up on it, and it's going to become relatively dry just from a good shakeout. The next thing that I want you to do is to give the tent a good shakedown as well. Hopefully it isn't all that wet to begin with, but again, you may get some on the sides, you may get some on the bottom, depending on how heavy the rain was. Give it a good shake. Then I want you to get out your camp towel, and everyone I hopefully will be bringing a camp towel with them. It's one of the pieces of equipment that I really, really recommend. You can even use a car chamois. There are all sorts of different places that you can get these things. The most important thing about them is that they are easily wring outable. Now an actual word, and you can keep reusing it and wringing out the moisture as time goes on. You do those two things, shake the tent, shake the rain fly, and then wipe things down with a camp towel. You're going to get rid of most of the moisture right there. That may be enough. If you're in a little more of a rush, that may be enough dryness to get it into your bags and go. If you aren't in a rush and it's breezy or better yet sunny, let the tent air out. Let the tent angle it so that it is in front of the sun as much as possible. That morning sun will dry things really fast on a good tent. Ditto with the rainfly. If you can get things completely dried out thoroughly and totally, that is your best bet. If you can't, if you're in a little bit more of a hurry, say, roll it up with the wet side out and bungee it to your rack so that it can dry as you pedal. That way, you'll be able to take advantage of a quicker exit, and of course, your tent's going to dry as you go along there. That's, of course, if the rain stopped. You'll be able to pack it up when you get a break and the tent is dry. If it's still drizzling, scenario number 2, or worse yet, still straight up raining, and you're intent on getting out of your tent and rolling, here's what I would recommend. It's hard to shake off that much wet when it is continuing to throw some wet at your tent, but do what you can. Getting underneath a tree canopy, or better yet, a picnic shelter, which you hopefully were under in the first place, and maybe you don't have to deal with this, that would be helpful. I always recommend, and what I always do is, if it is still raining, segregate the wet tent from other things as much as possible. It's best not to pack a tent that's wet in a waterproof bag, even in the rain. It's just not good for the tent. It's not good for the other stuff that might be inside your bag. Now, exception, of course, if the bag that you've got is only containing the wet gear, I guess it's no problem. If the inside of the tent is still dry and there's steady rain that would possibly make the inside of your tent a wet, soggy mess as opposed to just the outside, then what I would say is you may want to roll up the tent and get it inside a waterproof bag so that it doesn't get further wettened. So I would say roll it up so that the dry parts touch dry parts and the wet parts touch wet, just depending on your scenario. Keep the dry on the outside if it's going to go inside a bag while it's still raining. If for some reason it's still a little bit wet, where this is more for scenario number 1, you can roll it up so that the wet is on the outside and you bungee that up on your rack if it's not raining. If you're a hammock person, you're usually in better shape than tent people. A little bit easier. Pack up your hammock while you've got the fly over you and get it inside a dry bag and keep it dry as possible. That's your best bet. Worry about the tarp after you give it a good shakeout. If it's still raining, often you can get that relatively dry. Worst case, you just bungee that to the back of your rack. If you've got things like snake skins, you've got a Hennessy hammock. If this is not getting through to those of you who don't have hammocks, don't worry, it's over in about 20 seconds now. Then try to dry it off as much as possible with your camp towel before you get into the snake skins and pack it up. Hammock people, advantage for wet weather. Wet weather is advantage hammocks. Of course, you have to have trees or vertical things to hammock to, of course. So hopefully that's that. I hope that this is helpful. I found this through experience, but also through the experience of my limited experience with hiking in the Pacific Northwest way back in the day, but also ultralight hikers who have some really good tips. I've got a link in the show notes, and you can go to pedalshift.net/083 for a link to some, let me see here, sectionhiker.com, the folks who hike the Appalachian Trail, the PCT, things like that. They certainly have to deal with packing wet tents, and they've got some great tips in there that parallel the ones that I've talked about right here. So I hope that's helpful. That is tips and tricks on how to deal with a wet tent on a tour. As we close out the show, we'd like to thank everybody who helped support the Pedalshift project by joining the Pedalshift Society. We're talking $5, $2, $1 a month, or one-shot contributions, annual contributions. They all help make the show possible. They all help make me be able to give you more things like, say, the Pedalshift Guide to the Gap. So thank you all for your support. On to the Society. Ethan Georgi, Kimberly Wilson, Caleb Jenkinson, Cameron Lien, Andrew MacGregor, Michael Hart, Josiah Matthews, Keith Nagel, Brock Dittus, Thomas Skadow, Seth Krieger, Marco Lowe, Terrance Manson, Noah Schroer, Harry Telgadas, John Sikorski, Richard Killian, Chris Barron, Scott Taylor, Brian Hren, Mark Van Ram, Brad Hipwell, Paul Mulvey, Stuart Buchan, Todd Stutz, Mr. T, Roxy Arning, Nathan Poulton, Harry Hugel, Ferguson Meek, Stephen Dickerson, Vince LaGreco, and a big thank you also to all anonymous and past contributors for helping to make this show happen. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net. Lots of great content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through iTunes or your favorite podcast aggregator. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his debut album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Habitat, wherever cool music is available.